Hey everybody, I have ridden about 2 hours in 30-degree weather to get to my nearest Royal Enfield dealer, which is in Pembroke, Virginia, and it's called Gearhead Junction. And I want to give Terry and the crew a big thanks for letting me come down and film and loaning me an Interceptor so we can get it side by side with the Continental GT. Because a lot of people have been asking what I think about the Interceptor versus the GT. And truth be told, I was really close to buying an Interceptor, but the specific deal that I got on this GT was what sealed the deal. And just over time, after owning the GT, I'm really growing to like it even more. And what we're going to do here is, instead of like most videos comparing these two bikes, they end up being test rides and many reviews of the bikes. So people are trying to review the bike and compare them side by side, and they can't really get into the weeds of what the differences in the two bikes really mean as far as people owning the bikes and using them every day in the real world. And that's more what we're going to focus on. We're going to look at the actual differences in the two bikes and what they add up to, and whether they're, a lot of the things we hear about these two bikes is actually true or not. So let's start looking at the parts and see what the differences really are. Now, the first thing I have to say is I like the name Interceptor, even though in the United States it's called the Int 650 because Honda copped onto the name when Royal Enfield left the United States and they slapped it on the VFR. So Honda owns the Interceptor name, and so that's why in the US they're called the Int 650 instead of Interceptor. I'm OCD. I would buy the rest of the world side panels and put on my bike if I was to buy this bike in the United States. Interceptor just sounds cool. It reminds me of the opening sequence of Mad Max when they do the reveal of his car and it says Interceptor across the back. It just looks awesome, and that's what I think when I hear Interceptor. When I hear Continental GT, first thing is the Continental. It sounds to me like breakfast at a hotel. That's the first thing that comes to mind. But the GT is where it really starts to kick in, and the name really fits, actually, if you think about it. Because GT is an abbreviation for the Italian term Gran Turismo. And if we translate Gran Turismo into hillbilly, where I live, that means grand touring. So touring is obviously touring. Grand touring is doing touring on a sporting machine. A sportier car like a Bentley Continental or the Royal Enfield Continental GT. And the concept of grand touring originated in Europe, which is a continent. So that's where we get the name Continental Grand Touring. It fits. Now, the first and most glaring difference between these two bikes is the handlebars. The top clamps are different on each bike, where the GT is a smooth top clamp with no holes in it for mounting risers for regular bars. The Interceptor does. So that's your first difference. The next difference is the clip-ons versus regular bars. Now, the clip-ons are a little lower, about a ½ an inch more forwards, and they angle down slightly compared to the more flat bar of the Interceptor. The Interceptor's bars are actually an inch wider as well. So you've got a ½ an inch on each side that's wider on the Interceptor than they are on the GT. Moving back to the tanks are different. I think they both look good. The Interceptor's tank is more smooth and flowy, if that makes any sense. Even the sculpt out of the side here is more smoothed out. And so it just looks good, but it doesn't really stand out. I think it looks good, but it's common. Just about everybody makes a tank that looks like this. And so it's good. It's all right. It's there. GT, on the other hand, it starts off smooth on the surface, on the top surface, but then it gets angular on the side. And I think that mix of angled, flattish surfaces and smooth, flowy surfaces mixed together makes this kind of stand out a little bit. You don't see a tank like that every day. I do, but you know, you understand what I'm saying. You're not going to see a bunch of bikes with this style tank on them, where the tank on the Interceptor, you're going to see that more often. Now, the slab sides on the GT compared to the Interceptor also means that the Interceptor will hold a little more fuel, about 1 liter or so. You're going to get about an extra 20 miles worth of range on this bike versus this one. And 20 miles may not sound like a whole lot, but that's a long way to be pushing a bike when you're out of gas. Next difference is the foot controls and foot pegs. The foot pegs on the Interceptor are moved forwards, down, and out. So they're lower, wider, and further forward than on the GT. A lot of people call the GT an aggressive riding position, and it's more aggressive than the Interceptor, but I wouldn't consider it aggressive. Compared to a sports bike or an actual cafe racer, this is actually kind of toned down and a little bit softer, because the risers on the clip-ons, the bars would normally be here, down in this area on a cafe racer or a sport bike. You can see they're moved up. So they are up above the top clamp, and that softens the riding position a little bit, kind of like a sport touring bike compared to a sports bike. It's a little bit more relaxed riding position than the aggressive sport bike. And so I think that this really suits sport touring, better than most people give it credit for. When it comes to performance, since the engine, suspension, and all that's the same, drag racing these two bikes really is a wash. One's not really faster than the other. You could say that the GT has a bit of a weight advantage because it doesn't come stock with a center stand, but I've installed one on mine, and it holds about 1 liter's worth of fuel less, so you're saving a little bit of weight there. So a slight weight advantage on the GT, but I don't really see that coming into play in the real world. And when it comes to the handling characteristics of these two bikes, neither of these are track bikes. You don't want to take either of these and try pushing the limits of what they can do, because those limits aren't very far away. You want to stay within the realm of reasonable road speeds, for the street. And the higher speed handling advantage the GT should have in theory, I don't really think it materializes, because we're not really reaching the speeds where something like the lower, more aggressive bars and loading up your weight forward over that front wheel and getting it to bite, entering turns. I don't think we're going to see that, just due to the limitations of the suspension and things like that, and even the brakes. I just don't think all that's there. You might see it if you do a lot of modifications to the bike, upgrades to the suspension, brakes, things like that. Then it might get a little, a lot more aggressive. But stock for stock, like I said, I wouldn't push either of these, to the limit. So I don't really see the theoretical handling advantage at high speed that the GT should have. I don't see it materializing. And that's just my honest opinion, even though I own a GT. The narrower bars should mean that it takes more effort to get this bike twitchy in a corner compared to the Interceptor. The wider bars, less leverage is needed to do that. So maybe a little bit there just due to the bar width. But as far as high-speed handling, I'd put them both on equal footing. I don't see any situation where the GT is going to walk away from an Interceptor. I think it's going to hang right there with it and be on equal footing. Low speed is where I think the Interceptor actually has an advantage, and it's something we tend not to think about, because things like pulling into a gas station or a store parking lot from one riding surface to another and crossing, the little dips between the street and the parking lot, maneuvering around stuff like that, that's where the Interceptor really has an advantage, because I'll edit in some shots of my riding position sitting on each of these bikes, and standing on the Interceptor is much more advantageous than standing on the GT. And that allows you, and plus the wider foot pegs gives you a really solid stance when standing on the bike. And that's one of the reasons why this makes a great scrambler. I just think the lower speed handling characteristics on this bike are a lot better than the low speed handling characteristics of this bike, whereas the high speed handling characteristics of this bike may be marginally better than the high speed handling characteristics of this bike. So low speed, this is your bike. High speed, either one. Now what the GT does do is make you feel like you're going fast. It gives you a sensation of speed, like you're hunkered down and you're really out there doing your thing, and you're Carl Fogarty, giving the bird, and you're just doing it. For the Interceptor, it's going to be doing the same speeds, but you're in a more neutral riding position. And when I say neutral, I mean more neutral. I don't mean neutral. Because to me, the Interceptor is a little bit on the aggressive side of the scale too. If we look at a neutral bike, which would be like your classic 350 or your Bullet, you know, they're more neutral. The Interceptor is more aggressive than those bikes. So you've got the Bullet, the Interceptor, then the Continental GT stepping up more aggressive. And so I don't think this is a relaxed ride at all. I just say it's more relaxed than this one, not as relaxed as a Bullet. In most comparison videos that you see of these, people will say this is more comfortable than this one, so they would tend to tour more on this bike than they would on this bike, and I call total bullshit on that. Like I said, I rode 2 hours to get here on this bike, and I was perfectly fine. Butt was a little numb, but it would happen if I was on this bike too. So I don't see there being like a comfort issue on this bike. I get no weight on my wrist discomfort riding this bike. I don't get weight on my shoulders. I don't experience that. I think that's something that people assume, but it's not really true. Yes, with the more relaxed riding position, yes, this bike should, in theory, be more comfortable. But like I said, I'm not experiencing discomfort, so I can't say this is the more comfortable bike than this one. I think it's kind of a wash. Now, the only real discomfort I find riding long distances comes from the seat. And I would experience the same thing on this bike. And that is, I tend to be sitting, not on my sit bones, but I'm leaning more on my perineum riding the bike. And the same thing goes on this bike. And so the way I sit on these, like I said, I kind of lean forward on my perineum a little bit, and that causes a little bit of blood circulation issues. If you don't know what a perineum is, it's that little tiny plot of real estate in between your sewage plant and your amusement park, if you catch my drift. And when it comes to looks are a bit subjective. It's kind of like asking, you know, do you like vanilla ice cream or do you like chocolate ice cream? But I think the Continental GT is, I almost want to say it's an exercise in styling, but I know that's not true because the Continental GT was the original concept for the 650 platform. The Interceptor came after the GT, although they were both developed at the same time. The concept was first, this was something they kind of threw at the wall and it stuck, and now they sell about 5 of these for every one of these. So it's been a hit. But looks-wise, I prefer the Continental GT over the Interceptor. A lot of people will pick the Interceptor over the Continental GT. Like I said, it's kind of a wash. It's just what you like and what you don't. You want vanilla, you want chocolate. This one's all about the business. This one's all about the after party once work's over. And when it comes to what you're going to do with the bike, you know, do you want a standard bike and leave it alone? Or do you want to modify it and change it a little bit, you know, to what you really want out of a bike? I think the Interceptor is kind of the base platform. Like I said, even though it's not really true, I see it as the base platform because you could take an Interceptor and turn it into a cafe racer. You don't need to. The factory's already done that for you. Or you could take an Interceptor and go the other way and turn it into a scrambler or a bobber. You know, this would be the better platform for modding into another bike than this one. Turning this into a scrambler take a bit of effort, where it would take less effort to do so on this bike. So, like I said, it's kind of a spectrum. You got bobber and scrambler over here, Interceptor in the middle, you know, sporty cafe style on the other side. So I think this is the more versatile bike. That doesn't necessarily make it better, because a minivan is a versatile vehicle, but you don't see people buying posters of minivans and hanging them on the wall in their bedroom. Now, when it does come to touring, I do have to give the Interceptor the edge here, simply due to, once again, the styling. I think it's more receptive to saddlebags and things versus the GT, where you need to kind of be mindful of what you're going to put on a GT, or you're going to lose those looks, because that's the big advantage the GT has over the Interceptor, is the looks. where styling wise you could lose that if you put the wrong bags on it. Where the Interceptor, it really doesn't matter. You can put about anything on it and it'd look okay. And also, you can put a rear rack on either one of these. But it'd be a bit of a faux pas to do it on a cafe racer style bike. You don't want to put a rear rack on it where it wouldn't look out of place on this bike. So when you put a tail bag on it, you still got room for a passenger. Where if you put a tail bag on this bike, you're going solo. There's nowhere for the old lady or anybody else you want to tag along with you on the ride is going to sit. So I think the Interceptor is the better platform for touring. However, there is a bit of an X factor involved. Let's say I take a train from here to California. I'm on the East Coast. So if I go from here to California on a first class cabin on a train, and I've made YouTube videos showing that, nobody would care. Because that's what you'd expect, is, you know, you get on a train, you go. However, if I did the same video and same trip, but I jumped boxcars the whole way and rode in boxcars and, you know, lived like a hobo the whole time I was doing it, that's interesting. Because when it comes to traveling and things like that, you're either going to have a good time or you're going to have a good story to tell. That's the way it tends to work out. If you go on vacation, everything goes fine. You come home and want to share everybody your pictures, nobody gives a shit. You go on vacation and a hurricane hits or something like that goes on and there's some kind of disaster and things didn't go according to plan and you want to show everybody the video and pictures of that, that's interesting. So when it comes to touring, people would expect you to do it on this. They don't expect you to do it on this. So I think that's kind of an X factor that's involved. Be like Goldwing. If I wanted to tour from here to California and go see the Grand Canyon and all that, and I did it on a Goldwing, nobody would care. I might pique a little bit of interest doing it on this one. Probably going to pique a lot of interest doing it on this bike. So the X factor there, I think, goes to the GT. So in conclusion, my thoughts on these bikes, I like them both. I think the Interceptor is going to be the more versatile bike and the easier bike to live with on a day-to-day basis. But if you can put up with any of the GT's shortcomings, you know, you get to ride around, you get to feel cool and just ride around like James Bond on rollerblades. The Interceptor reminds me of like my high school sweetheart. She was a good-looking girl. She wasn't the prom queen, but she was attractive. She was smart, intelligent, and safe to bring around to parents. Continental GT, on the other hand, kind of reminds me of that fire-breathing whore I used to hook up with down in South America, because quite frankly, I've done things on both of them I'd rather my wife never hear about.
What the f did you just say?
That was a long time ago.